Thank you very much. So as we were talking about this panel, we decided that my role today is to try to convince you that you really need to pay attention to everybody else. So what I'm going to do in terms of this discussion is try to set up and explain the changing nature of the way people are consuming information, and hopefully by the end of it, not only will you realize that the following speakers are incredibly important, but if you're not already taking part in this information revolution or your companies are not doing so, hopefully this will provide a little bit of an impetus as to why it's worth your while. So first off, chart, I assume people have seen something like this in the past, if not necessarily this specific chart. And what this shows is the changing nature of media consumption. This chart doesn't talk about the total amount of time people are consuming media, but it shows the difference in the channels that they preferred from 2010 to 2014. 2010 is sort of an important year in the overall history of communications and the adoption of mobile and social. Does anybody know what technology, what major landmark event happened in February of 2010? Nobody? This thing came out, the iPad. And the iPad was huge. And the iPad was huge for a lot of reasons. But one of the things that it did was that doctors fell in love with it. The adoption rates were astonishing with physicians. So if you communicate at all with HCPs, the odds are they have one of these. It's also a mobile device. And so that was the last year where we get data on consumption of mobile prior to the adoption of the iPad. One of the things that you see, note that television is not going away, right? Back in 2010, 41% of people's time was spent consuming television. In 2014, it was 37%. So you're seeing a dip, but it's still the dominant player within the overall ecosystem in terms of information consumption. But digital has grown tremendously, right? Digital went from 30% of people's time to 47% of people's time overall. So nearly half of their time is using some form of digital communication. Note where that came from. That came from print primarily, right? Print, which just fell off a cliff from 8% of people's time down to 3% of people's time. You know, dead trees just are no longer the primary means that people have for gaining information. But even within digital, I want you to notice that, you know, desktop, laptop actually went down. It decreased by 4% overall from 22 to 18% of people's time. But mobile absolutely exploded. It went from a relatively minuscule and unimportant 4% of people's time up to being nearly a quarter of the total time. By the way, if you're curious about that last column, other digital, what in the world is other digital if it's not mobile and it's not desktop? Well, any of you watch Netflix? Any of you watch Netflix on your TV? Right? That's other digital. So-called over-the-top transmissions where it's digital communication. You're not watching TV, but you're not using it on your mobile device. You're not using it on your laptop. That's the type of thing where we're again seeing significant adoption, significant growth rates. And of course, that's just about the media people consume and and then the question becomes, what are they doing in these channels? Where are they and why are they talking about it? You know, in the new and emerging technologies field, some of you might have heard of the terms MOSO and SOMO. And the reason that they're being thrown around is to describe the overlapping and the merging and the blending between mobile and social. People are using their mobile devices an astonishing amount, and a lot of what they're doing on those mobile devices is spending time on social media, right? So that's why a lot of it, what's going on is even if you're participating in social media, but you're thinking in terms of the primary interaction being the desktop or the laptop, that's not actually what people are doing. What they're doing more and more is they're using their phones, they're using their tablets, etc., to take advantage of these communications. And if people are talking about anything, they're talking about their health. I often say that the first sentence that was ever uttered was probably "my back hurts," right? Because health is so central to who we are, what we are as creatures, that's just what we talk about. And so if we're talking at all, we're probably talking about health. If your company makes a product that affects people's health, then the odds are that there's a conversation going on about those products. So I found this image out on Flickr, and the image was titled something like, "Where is this guy?" Because he's on a train commuting somewhere, but he's clearly not at all paying attention to the beautiful landscape out the window. He's not at all paying attention to anybody else in the train. He's completely absorbed in his screen. And I don't know what this particular person was, but there's a good chance that what he was doing was that he was on Facebook. One stat that just blows my mind is 1 out of every 5 minutes that a person spends on their phone, they're spending on Facebook on average. So that's just to emphasize the fact that this is just the way people are communicating in general and how they're getting their information, how they're consuming it. If anything is going to happen, if any changes are going to happen to those numbers moving forward, this change is going to accelerate. There's an old saying in demographics that demography is destiny, and millennials love their devices and they love their communication channels these ways, and they trust them. And they trust them in ways that older generations are not necessarily comfortable with and don't always fully appreciate. So Price Waterhouse did a study several years ago that according to which 90% of millennials would trust information gained via social media about what they should do regarding their health. All right, so that's where these trends are headed. That's absolutely what we're seeing. And note that I'm not just talking about consumers or patients. Doctors are people too. Doctors tend to be wealthier than usual. Also, by the way, they love Apple. Right? Apple products are at a premium. They cost more. Doctors are willing to spend that increased money. So when you're considering, adoption patterns, that's the platform that they're actually using. This was the most reliable statistic that I could find on doctors' adoption of social media. 56% of physicians use social media for professional purposes. I got to tell you, I think that's way too low because YouTube alone is just an enormously popular platform for learning information, and doctors talk about their use of YouTube all the time to stay up to date on information. So I think that figure is probably low, but it certainly gives you some idea for what we're seeing within the healthcare community as a whole. Now, that all is just talking about the communications revolution, but as we all know, as Aristotle taught us and Gary Larson reminded us, nature abhors a vacuum. And so if you're not participating in these forums, if you're not engaging in the conversation that's going on out there, then other people will. Right? So your choice is not about whether you are going to adopt these patterns. The choice is whether your information is going to be part of the conversation. And this is where I don't simply report on trends, but I hopefully become a little bit of an evangelist for you to say, you have an obligation to get out there and provide information about your products in these venues. There's a ton of stuff out there on the internet, and some of it is not very good information. But when we're dealing with FDA-regulated firms and your communications, then that information, simply by virtue of the fact that you're regulated by the FDA, is going to be of a higher quality than the other information that's out there. So it's actually extremely important that you look to figuring out how you can participate in these platforms and do so compliantly. And with that, I'll turn it over to our next speaker, Colleen.